or an orange, I think we agree that we want to be on the green part. So we have to achieve functional ecosystems, and especially in this case, I'm talking about forests. So what does function mean? And so when you look at the two cases I've shown here, so species A and species B in case one are functionally similar. And in this case, very simplified, it could be the tree heights, the crown shape are the same, maybe even the root systems. And in case two, species A and species B are functionally dissimilar. So the question then is, what does that mean? And what are the consequences of this? And so functionally similar species, the likelihood that they're going to compete with each other in a restoration program are higher compared to functionally dissimilar species. And so in other words, functionally dissimilar species more likely will complement each other. And I think this has major implications because obviously we want to invest our money wisely. And when you plant the forest will go through a stem thinning phase after the planting. And so the more dissimilar the species are functionally, the more likely it is they're going to survive the process, and the complexity of new forest is higher. So in other words, the more functionally dissimilar species we have, the higher the structural complexity of the resulting forest. So I was looking a little bit into the literature. What are the frameworks around? And when you look at the column in the middle here, you can see what I mean with structural complexity. So we know there are single-layered forests, there can be multi-layered forests, either open or dense. Now, single-layered forests are natural in some parts of the world, but when we talk about humid tropical forests, we are really talking about multi-layered open or dense forests. And so how can we achieve that kind of multi-layered canopy by planting? So this is the real question here. And so the framework I was looking at, obviously the factors which are relevant are very diverse. I mean, there are some factors which are sort of abiotic in nature, like natural disturbances, climate, soil and topography, anthropogenic disturbances. But I really think the four green ones are really key aspects of trying to achieve functional structural complexity. And so the first one is tree species composition. We heard a lot about this before. Functional diversity. What I mean with that, I will explain the next couple of slides. Complementarity in crown architecture is really, really important. And then tree size distribution diversity. And so all these together give a spatial pattern of canopy space occupation. And so this refers then to the structural complexity. And as I say on the right side here, scientifically uninformed restoration usually only gives you a very simple forest. So a single-layered canopy or a plantation forest, but definitely not a multi-structured or multi-layered canopy. And as we all know, human well-being and biodiversity rely on really multi-layered dense forests. And we just heard this morning about the quetzal in Guatemala. Of course, the bird needs a healthy, functional forest ecosystem. So what do we need to know about forests then to be able to restore them? And usually a reference forest is needed, and we have to assess the forest quantitatively. This is done using permanent forest monitoring plots where EBH, coordinates of each tree, and usually height is measured. Now, in the Forest Geo Network, for example, height is not measured, but I would recommend that in quantitative forest assessments, height is included. Based on that information, we can get tree species composition, complementarity in ground architecture, as you see in here, is something separately to be assessed. And I'll talk about this in a minute. Then functional diversity and tree size distribution are related to functional traits of individual trees. And I explain this also in a minute. So functional diversity, in principle, is diversity of traits of the species. And a lot of taxonomists, phylogeneticists, they use phylogenies to map functional traits onto evolutionary trees. And an example here, you can see here a very classical example of lobelia, which has sort of herbaceous plants in the north, and in the south, they can be either shrubby or even trees. So the size, for example, and the height and are traits which are relevant within restoration. And these functional traits are a result of adaptive evolution, very often either randomly or by factors driving it. So there could be time, spatial heterogeneity, resource competition, predation, and so on. It's a long list of factors which influence the evolution of species. But obviously the resulting traits are really important for restoration because we want to select the right tree for the right place. And usually in diverse tropical ecosystems, the niche breadth for each species is rather small. So if we don't meet the niche, they won't grow. And so I think to understand the functional diversity of species is important. What do we need to know about tree species composition? And so people working in quantitative forest ecology publish tons of papers about this, but usually it's about species richness, abundance, and evenness. And so the classical graphs you can get from this are actually fairly simple. So the first one basically says that the forest is highly diverse and mixed. The second curve is that species have an uneven distribution, which means that some species are really, really common and dominate the community, whereas others are fairly rare. And this is a very typical pattern in tropical forests. You have some fairly common species, but then a huge amount of fairly rare ones. So now, in restoration, what we're trying to achieve is to assemble a community artificially. And so functional trait diversity, we can define in different ways, but just very briefly, for a single tree, we have whole plant traits and also leaf traits. And so whole plant traits are the ones which are the most important ones, and especially tree heights, crown shape, and things like this are really important information we need for restoration. Although, having said that, leaf traits, for example, can also be used to select species for restoration. So, for example, large leaf, shade-tolerant species are not the best candidates for very open conditions. So, obviously, the leaf traits can help to filter and select the right species. But here example where we can see different tree heights, so canopy trees, sub-canopy trees, and understory trees. This is based on a 50-hectare plot or 60-hectare plot in Hainan. But the important message here is that abundance is not the same for different tree species. So some are ultra common, some are really rare. So now, in other words, if you have a sub-canopy tree like this one here, it has about 10,000 individuals in 60 hectares, larger than 1 centimeter in diameter. So in comparison, the canopy tree on the left has only 260 individuals. So now, if you plant the rare tree in the same number like the very common one, the forest will fail because natural abundances have to be incorporated in the planting design. So now, when it comes to tree size distribution, how do we measure this? And obviously, yes, you can use a laser in the forest and measure height. But of course, a new way of doing this is using LiDARs and drones and aerial surveys. And by doing so, one can scan with a LiDAR system a forest. And then based on the scan, one can isolate individual trees. And then based on the isolation, you can get a very accurate estimation of height, diameter, as well as a crown size and shape. And so a number of functional traits then can be derived from this, like tree height, canopy cover, crown stem ratio, and crown structure. And so this leads to the next trait, which I think is one of the most important ones, is complementarity in crown architecture. So obviously, not every tree looks the same, but then we can basically generalize crown types very easily. And the diversity of this is surprisingly low. And so here you can see sort of scans of trees, and then these different sort of crown shapes are translated into some models. And obviously what I mean with complementarity is here in the lower graph here, tree type with this shape and this shape, they together complement each other. They would not compete the same way as they would have the same shape. And I think this is very important because as trees grow up in the restoration plot, this is relevant from the first day of planting. And eventually, as the trees grow older and larger, they change their shape. It's very common with pine trees, for example. They have a more triangular shape when young, but when mature, it kind of looks completely different. So in other words, they might compete when they are young with other trees, but when they are mature, they complement. And so obviously this is very important during the succession of the forest to be aware how the shape of trees will change. And so a classical example here is it's a modeled artificial forest. And in the first case, case A, we have five functionally similar species, and they together create a forest as the forest grows older. But unfortunately, they will heavily compete with each other, and the forest will look still like a plantation, even though five different species have been planted. Whereas if you use five functionally dissimilar species in case two, the complexity of the forest structure gets higher. In other words, the functional diversity of the individual species in the collective result in higher structural complexity. And even more, if more elaborate planting approaches are used, like a nucleation approach, where only islands are planted, and if the islands are planted with a set of very different different species, you get the highest complexity of the resulting forest. So this has not really been shown. It's a hypothesis. So what I'm saying here is that functional diversity is more important than species diversity to achieve the structural complexity. And I would say, especially if only a limited number of species are planted. So now, did I make this up? Maybe to some extent, but we have done some plots in Hong Kong over a couple of years where some of these was tested. Unfortunately, the results are not quantitatively available as much as I would like to have them available. But I just show the next couple of slides, some examples in the form of photos to sort of give some ideas of how that looks like. So in Hong Kong, we planted 520 times 20 meters experimental plots. And in total, more than 1,000 different species were planted in the plots. And the total experimental area is about 20 hectares. And so this is a plot where 10 different species were planted. But unfortunately, when the trees were selected more than 30 years ago, no one thought about tree heights and crown shape. And so now all the trees grow the same speed, have the same maximum height, and a very similar crown shape. So what happened was that the trees at some point stopped growing. Stem density is very high. They basically kill each other at the moment. But this is going on for more than 15 years. And so in other words, that's what we call arrested succession. There is no more progress at the moment. It may change in the future, but so far it's not, and there is no understory. Very quickly, two other plots. One had a lower number of species planted on the left. So the resulting forest was only two-layered, whereas on the right-hand side is a hyper-diverse planting, and a multi-layered forest was achieved. And in this case, on the right-hand side, at least 500 different species were planted from understory all the way to the canopy. So just very quickly, this is how the project site looked like in 2004. It was a burned hillside. And in 2014, individuals were planted randomly, but also experimental plots were established on the site. And by now, a closed canopy has been achieved, very diverse mix of species. So more than 400 different tree species are coexisting in these plots. And I think this is one of the examples where a scientific approach was used to guide a restoration program. And I would like to encourage everyone to collaborate with us, develop more plots like this around the world, to advance the science of restoration ecology and sort of drift away from random tree planting to sequester carbon or whatever the motivations are. Thank you very much.
So we're on time right now, so we do have time for a couple questions.
So I'd like to know if you have any thoughts about how functional diversity and phylogenetic diversity could be integrated into like IUCN assessments. Have you longitudinal results.
You mean for IUCN threat assessment? Yeah, I mean, phylogenetic diversity is one way of describing diversity generally, and I think it's a fairly fast way, given the advancements of sequencing technologies, to come up with a taxonomic backbone. And obviously, phylogenetic diversity, I don't know whether you're familiar with edge analysis, but obviously in terms of conservation so actions, one can filter by clades and prioritize species. So what we would do is clades with shallow clades in the phylogeny with many species which are genetically similar compared to very deep clades. So when you prioritize, you would go for the deeper clades because they have a more genetic uniqueness compared to species in the shallow clade. So obviously, one or two from the shallow clade are sufficient, maybe if we have triage, but the deep clades, for example, are more important because they have a more genetic diversity. Genetic phylogenetics can definitely be used to prioritize conservation.
Thank you very much for the great talk. My question is about if you have considered the level of detail of the architectural types of trees, for instance, of Halley et al. In the 70s, that they had the classification of 20 more or less different types of trees based on branching and the balance of the crowns at that level of detail for assembling your restoration models?
I have to say, the crown architecture is work in progress. So the project I've shown was not designed having, at the beginning, we did not know the crown architecture of the trees. So I think this is ongoing research, and generalized models very often were based on temperate trees like beeches and oaks in temperate regions, whereas the diversity of crown shapes in the tropics is much, much higher, I guess. So it needs proper, I don't think that a generalized models can really capture this. And I think the future would be the LiDAR scans. And then out of the LiDAR scan, maybe some more generalized models could be developed, crown architecture models. I don't think they're there yet. So I think it's work in progress.
You could have a round of applause. Thank you.